Good morning, friends. Today we are going to discuss a new poem in your textbook, that is There's a Hole in the Bucket. अशी ती कवितेचं नाव आहे आणि एकदम छानपैकी ती अशी कवितासुद्धा आहे. तर आपण आता कवितेचं वाचन करू आणि तुम्ही ती कविता संपूर्णपणे तुमच्या वर्गपाठाच्या वहीमध्ये लिहायची आहे. सो गो. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Lisa, dear Lisa. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Lisa, there's a hole. Then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fix it. With what should I fix it, dear Lisa, dear Lisa? With what should I fix it, dear Lisa, with what? With a straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With sorry, with a straw, dear Henry, with a straw. But the straw is too long, dear Lisa, dear Lisa. The straw is too long, dear Lisa, too long. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Lisa, dear Lisa? With what shall I cut it, dear Lisa, with what? With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With an axe, dear Henry, an axe. But the axe is too dull, dear Lisa, dear Lisa. The axe is too dull, dear Lisa, too dull. So, next, baga. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, sharpen it. With what should I sharpen it, dear Lisa, dear Lisa? With what should I sharpen, dear Lisa, with what? With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, a stone. But the stone is too dry, dear Lisa, dear Lisa. The stone is too dry, dear Lisa, too dry. Then wait it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then wait it, dear Henry, dear Henry, wait it. With what should I wait it, dear Lisa, dear Lisa? With what should I wait it, dear Lisa, with what? With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, with water. But how shall I get it, dear Lisa, dear Lisa? But how shall I get it, dear Lisa? But how? In the bucket, dear Lisa, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. In the bucket, dear Henry, in the bucket. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Lisa, dear Lisa, dear Lisa. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Lisa, there's a hole. तर अशा पद्धतीने ही खूप गमतीची अशी कविता आहे. हेनरी आणि लिझा यांच्यामधला हा संवाद आहे. तर आता आपण तुम्ही ही जी कविता आहे ती तुमच्या वहीत लिहा आणि नेक्स्ट सेशनला मी तुम्हाला याचं भाषांतरसुद्धा करून दाखवणार आहे. ही कविता तुम्ही घरी लिहा, वाचन करा, त्याचा व्हिडिओ काढा आणि मला पाठवा.